All right, let's bring in Robert Baines, President CEO of the NATO Association of Canada. Thanks for your time. Let's start with that new information, the movement on Sweden. Key to Turkey agreeing to move forward on the NATO application has been Sweden's fight against terrorism. They wanted Sweden to do more. What changed here? Did Sweden offer to do more on this front?
Well, Marilla, I suspect that is the case. The details have not come through as far as I'm aware of, but Turkey has been very concerned about some of the terrorist activity on its borders. Turkey has taken in about 4.5 million refugees from Syria, and that border has had some significant issues. So they are, not surprisingly, very concerned about the security issues there. But this decision is not without significant political wrangling. NATO is all about coming to consensus, so Turkey did have the capacity to kind of hold NATO for ransom for certain demands. We just don't know exactly what those are. Sweden, along with Finland, both made certain assurances of new legislation for anti-terrorism that did address some of Turkey's concerns. But it's tough to know what else happened behind the scenes. So all I can say is that consensus is an amazing tool to build agreement between all of the NATO members, which will now include 32, of course.
So earlier in the day, Turkey had all of a sudden said, we want to get into the EU. They have an application to join the European Union. And in an effort to move aside for Sweden, we want to push through our application for EU. That seemed to disappear by the afternoon. Any understanding of why or how that happened?
I think at that point, there are a lot of different maneuverings that happen. I could not tell you what the backroom politics of that was, only to say that obviously NATO and the EU are very two different creatures. They contain a lot of the same members, but of course, with the United States and Canada being in NATO, there is quite a different concern of both entities. So I suspect that may have been a bit more grandstanding to see if they could get some last-minute concessions. But I don't think that was really a serious concern on their part.
No real timeline has been offered for Sweden to make it official. I'm just wondering, what could that look like? Could it be months? Could it still be a year away?
Well, as with Finland, we saw a rapid succession. A lot of the groundwork has already been done. All of the administrative work, all of the bureaucracy of NATO clearly knows exactly how to do this in a quick manner now. So I suspect we'll see something very fast, certainly within the same year's time span that it took for Finland as well. But it's really quite something that's amazing that Canadians should appreciate just how valued the NATO membership has been for both Finland and Sweden. And it reminds us just how valuable the idea of an attack upon one is an attack upon all means for our security.
What does this country bring to the alliance?
Canada. Well, you've heard a lot today about our expeditionary capacity, about our contributions to every single NATO operation in the history of the alliance. The problem, as was just discussed in the past 5 minutes, is that our GDP spending ratio, i.e. 2%, is just not there. So we have a tremendous amount to offer. It's just not in the pure spending. I and many others in the Canadian thought space do think that we should be spending more on defense, but I'm not adverse to trying to see how we can count that contribution differently. I'm just concerned that we take it seriously. Most Canadians were somewhat taken aback when it was mentioned that we are not even thinking of reaching 2%. And if we're not, we should explain how we expect to be measured. And if that's not just cash, it should be measured specifically on capabilities and what we bring to the fight, as it were. And so this move to add more soldiers to our Latvian enhanced forward presence is a motion towards that. But I expect to see more in the coming months.
But do other countries have that same deal in place? Do they offer something instead of GDP that they contribute, or is Canada sort of going out on its own to try to get this?
No, perhaps I should have been a little more clear. They count other things. So there should be some discussion, some reckoning as to what can be considered for Canada as taking part in that 2% being towards defence. Obviously, a lot of our budget towards global affairs goes towards that. Some of our cyber content goes towards that as well, fighting cybercrime. So I think it's just a matter of trying to make that work a bit more in our favor. But when it comes to the brass tacks, we need to make sure that we are getting our boots on the ground, equipped properly, and that we have the capacity to deal with many crises at the same time, as we are living in a much different world than we were 10 years ago.
Okay, let's get to another country that is desperate to join NATO. Of course, that is Ukraine. Here's what Stoltenberg had to say just in April. We'll listen to that for a moment.
Let me be clear. Ukraine's rightful place is in the Euro-Atlantic family. Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO. And over time, our support will help you make this possible.
Volodymyr Zelensky will join the NATO meeting on Wednesday. How do you read what Stoltenberg is saying about Ukraine's rightful place? Can we expect from this summit a further reading into the joining of NATO by Ukraine?
I think that is going to be a major point of contention. We already heard President Biden say that that is not on the table, but I suspect there are going to be different ways of approaching this issue. As most people have seen by this point, the fight in Ukraine against the invasion of Russia has really been cast in the idea of a fight for democracy, for all those values that we espouse here as part of NATO and as part of a democratic country. So trying to make sure that Ukraine is as supported as possible is really a big issue as far as NATO is concerned. Canada has been supporting their membership for quite some time, and so I suspect that there's going to be a lot of positioning regarding this topic.
So some have called for Ukraine to be exempt from membership obligations. There's a process we know to join NATO. I'm going to just put up a graphic to show people what it looks like. You can see that there are ways to move forward and how to move forward. A program is designed to assist countries wishing to join the alliance that they go through. They get advice and they get guidance from other NATO countries on everything from the politics, the economic differences, how to measure up defense, resource security, even legal aspects. Can you see some of that being put aside for the Ukraine application?
Well, it's tricky when that happens. NATO does not have any capacity to monitor or to adjust its members once they are already a part of the alliance. There is no way to catch up on people and to survey them after they're already a member. You cannot kind of put a sanction on a country after it's been a member as far as their actual membership is concerned. So the admission process is quite important. The idea is to make sure that the alliance itself is becoming stronger. Now, at the same time, I think there are a few people who would admit that Ukraine has a weak military. It has probably one of the most experienced and strongest and most energetic militaries in the world at the moment. So that has certainly put it in its good stead. The key behind that is to make sure that all of the institutional frameworks behind it, as you were mentioning in the membership action plan there, that those are all ready to go. But I know that there's been a lot of work on that as well. The key is I don't think that there are going to be enough votes to say that we should kind of wink at these or allow that there are going to be countries vouching for Ukraine's submission to these membership action plan elements.
The Ukrainian leader says he wants to be considered, or the country should be considered as a de facto NATO, part of NATO. Could you see perhaps a separate category being carved out for Ukraine where they are not a full-fledged member, but there's something in between?
Well, I mean, the whole nub of NATO itself is the Article 5. I mean, there are many other great aspects of NATO, training together, working together, developing interoperability between our militaries, which is already happening in Ukraine's case. We're already training a lot of their soldiers, et cetera. We're giving them a lot of our kit. So, I mean, there is some of that already there. But the Article 5 guarantee is what makes NATO itself. It is the really make or break situation of NATO. And its very flexibility is what has allowed it to last so long. countries are only required to support in the way that they feel fit. But the way that that's built, the way that that is made through consensus, is what happens tomorrow and the day after. That is the kind of strength that we have through discussion and agreement. And once that agreement is made, it's rock hard. So to have a NATO pseudo inclusion already that makes it somewhat difficult. It's just not the same thing without that Article 5 guarantee.
Robert Baines, good to have you on this, sir. Thanks for joining us on the program tonight.
Thanks, Marilla.